Welcome back, you lovely human beings. This is Imperfect Progress with your host, Hennessy, a safe space to dive into the experiences, feelings, and tools that make up a full and flawed life. Today we're talking about coping skills. Have you ever felt absolutely triggered? I know, another cultural buzzword. But to me, being triggered just means that there's some in-the-moment experience that brings up a very strong, challenging, and overpowering emotion or thought. Now, these triggers are alarm bells in our brains, little messages letting us know that something is out of sorts. Our brains are such wonderfully complex organs, and scientists and psychologists are really just starting to understand the intricacies of it. Therefore, my knowledge as an average young woman who's been through some therapy and read some books is very small. But I want to share the little bits I have learned because, small as they may be, I know that they really were life-changing for me. They gave me a whole new frame of reference for what I experience when I feel out of control. So, my favorite explanation of the brain uses a hand model. I like that it's simple and it's visual. It works really well to teach kids about the brain, which is probably why I'm so drawn to it. It's just easy to understand. So to start, make a fist with your thumb tucked inside. The 4 fingers on top represent your upstairs brain. In scientific terms, this part of our brain is the prefrontal cortex. This is where all of our problem solving, rational thinking, empathy, communication skills, planning, and logic live. Our upstairs brain helps us to think before we act. Now, the thumb tucked inside represents your downstairs brain, specifically your amygdala and brainstem. Now, these parts of our brain control our survival and safety instincts. This is where the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn part of your brain lives. Our downstairs brain is the reactive, act first, think later center. The metaphor really comes to life when you think about building a house. You can't have a second floor without a first floor. Similarly, if your downstairs brain feels like it's in danger, whether or not you are actually in a life-threatening situation, then your upstairs brain cannot do its job of logical processing and problem solving. So with your closed fist, go ahead and pop those 4 fingers straight up into the air. This is called flipping your lid. This is what happens when we experience that emotional, mental, or sensory overload. To bring it back to the buzzword, this is what happens when we get triggered. Flipping your lid is an internal alarm that lets you know that something feels wrong or bad or unsafe. And our brain's primary job is to make sure that we are safe. And it's always trying to bring us back to homeostasis. Now, there is a middle school biology word that you never thought you'd have to hear again, but quick review. Homeostasis is a proper physiological and psychological balance within your brain and body. So when we feel triggered, our brains release different hormones. Most commonly, you hear about the stress hormone cortisol. And that boosts your energy, makes you more vigilant, and these processes can be such helpful tools when you're being chased by a bear. They are much less helpful when you are just trying to order food at a really busy Qdoba. Now, when I first learned about the upstairs and downstairs brain, I was pretty dumbfounded. It went against much of what I'd been taught about handling my wayward thoughts and feelings. I thought that I was supposed to confront my big emotions with truth and logic so that they would realize that there was no reason for them to be acting up so much. My mind was supposed to be this battlefield where my positive thoughts could cancel out the negative ones and subdue my emotional tsunamis. Now, when I learned that I can't think or process my way out of being dysregulated, I was simultaneously disappointed and relieved. I felt disappointed because that meant many of the fights I had waged within myself at 3 a.m. were pretty futile. I felt relieved because it meant that I wasn't weak or inferior for not being able to reason my way out of the spirals. Now, flipping your lid can look very different depending on who you are and what the trigger is. This is part of that fight or flight or freeze or fawn response. And we each have access to all of these responses, but most of us have one or two that are our go-to. Since your downstairs brain is in control at this point, you don't get to choose which strategy you use. Your brain chooses for you. Now, I tend to either freeze or fawn. So basically, I either play dead and pretend like I don't exist, like a possum, or I try to people please my way out of the unsafe situation. I was not born a fighter, but some people are. When my lid flips, I get quiet or I cry. I want to hide. Some people get big and loud and they scare that threat away and they beat it down. And some people run. They just book it out of that unsafe situation as fast as they can. Again, these tools are so useful during a bear chase, but not when you need to flag down the waitress for more ketchup. So then I had a question. If I can't problem solve or rationalize my flipped lid back into place, and my brain's survival skills aren't what I really need at the moment, how do I restore the balance? How do I get my upstairs brain back? Because as much as I joke about wishing I could switch places with my dog, I don't actually want to be an animal focused primarily on survival. The answer came to me in coping skills. Now, for the purpose of this episode, when I say coping skills, I'm talking about self-regulation tools that restore homeostasis. Since we cannot reset our nervous system by just thinking, we have to incorporate some kind of action or movement. This reset lets you walk back up to the second floor of your brain and do some rational thinking about what the trigger was, why it triggered you, what you can do to soften the blow in the future, etc. Now, there are endless amounts of coping skills, but today I want to share 3 that I have found most helpful. If these don't resonate with you, that's okay. It doesn't mean that you're beyond coping skills. It just means that you have to find the right fit for you. And this is a very personal journey, and only you can decide if a tool is helpful or not. So after this episode, if none of this resonated with you, hop on Google or talk to your counselor or a friend and just find out what else there is out there. So the first tool I want to share with you is probably the most common, and that is box breathing. I first learned about box breathing when I was in an inpatient psychiatric care facility. My depression and anxiety symptoms had reached an all-time high, and for my own safety, I checked into an inpatient program. Now, I will talk about that whole experience in another episode, but for now, I will just tell you that the lovely professionals there taught me most of the coping skills that I still use today. Box breathing is very simple. You can do it with your eyes open or closed. You start by drawing a box with your pointer finger. So you're going to draw a line up and breathe in for 4 counts. Now draw a line across and hold for 4. While you draw the line down, you breathe out for 4. And when you connect it back over to where you started, you're holding it for 4 more counts. So repeat this as long as you need to until you feel ready to stop. And the hand motion and the mental counting, they help focus your mind. Meanwhile, the controlled breathing exercise does all sorts of wonderful things to counteract the hormones and other physiological responses that your dear little survival brain has set into motion. Now, I have a very vivid memory of sitting in my window in my hospital room when I first learned this. So I was looking outside at the changing leaves and the happy-looking people walking down the street, and I suddenly felt trapped inside of this building, and I felt hopeless. I felt like my chances were dismal for ever feeling well enough to be one of those happy people walking down the street again, and I started to spiral, like deep, dark spiraling. And one of the nurses came to check on me, and he noticed that I was very obviously not okay. And I used to think it was really annoying for people to say, just breathe, when I was sobbing and like hyperventilating. Like, don't you think I'm trying? It's just not working right now. I don't know how. But it made all the difference in the world when this nurse sat down and taught me how to breathe. And not only that, but he did the exercise and the counting with me. And I slowly felt my breathing change. I felt it deepen. And the tension I was holding in my chest and my shoulders relaxed. I felt like I was softening and expanding to fill and feel my whole body again. So yes, try box breathing. It's very simple and it's very effective. Now, one of my favorite coping skills is called 5-4-3-2-1. It's a 5 senses activity that is meant to ground you in the moment that you're in. This is a mindfulness exercise where you practice being in the present. It works best if you talk out loud. Now, it might feel silly to be talking to yourself, but there's something about speaking that sets us free from the thoughts we get tangled up in. Sometimes when you're dysregulated, it feels like your words are stuck in your throat. And when you can start speaking out loud, it really changes something in how you're feeling. So for this exercise, you start by listing 5 things that you see. Then 4 things that you can hear. 3 things that you can feel, touch. 2 things that you smell. And 1 thing that you taste. The more specific you can be, the more grounded you will feel. The first time that I practiced this outside of a clinical environment, I was on a walk with one of my friends. And at this point, we were post-college roommates, dear friends living in a tiny town trying to figure out adulthood. We went for a walk because my mood had started to plummet, and I needed an extra boost. So my friend reminded me of the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise. I had been very excited about all of my new skills when I came home from the hospital and immediately shared them with my friends and family. Partially out of enthusiasm because I just love learning and I like to share that learning with others, and partially because I knew that it would be helpful to teach other people how to support me so that if I'm caught in a spiral, someone else can come alongside me and use those coping skills with me, help me co-regulate. So my friend asked me each of the questions, all the 5 senses, one by one, and begrudgingly, I didn't have a good attitude about it. I answered them. I remember thinking and probably even saying out loud that this was pointless and it was stupid and it was not going to work, and that after the exercise was done, all of my problems would still be there. Now, part of that was true. This coping skill did not change my circumstances. But it wasn't pointless. By the time we hit taste, I noticed that my mind was calmer and clearer. I noticed that my breathing had slowed and my fists weren't clenched anymore. I was able to focus on walking with my friend and just noticing the quaint little houses around us. It helped me survive a moment so that that moment didn't turn into a whole evening or day or week of spiraling. And that's really the best we can do, is just take care of ourselves in the present moment and the next present moment and the next. The last tool I'll share with you today is a grounding exercise involving ice, of all things. I have found this to be especially helpful when I'm struggling with thoughts of self-harm or having suicidal ideations or other reckless impulses. So you start by grabbing an ice cube from your freezer. If you don't have ice, run some very cold water in the sink and follow a similar process. So switch the ice cube back and forth between your two hands. Rub them with your fingers. Squeeze them or just let them sit and melt. No matter what you do with them, focus on noticing how they feel and speak your observations out loud to yourself. Again, the more specific you are in your noticing, and if you can say it out loud, even though you might feel silly, the better it is for you. Absolutely ridiculous. That was my first thought when the inpatient clinician taught us about this practice. I couldn't think of a moment when I would need to just grab a chunk of ice and hold on to it. Well, never say never, because a day did come where holding on to a chunk of ice helped me ride out a pretty big storm. I'd come home from a particularly rough day at work. We all have them. One of the teens I was working with was majorly dysregulated all day. He'd threatened staff, threw a chair across the room, broke other kids' presentations, ran outside into traffic. It was a whole day of stress. And that left me really anxious and dysregulated. So once I got home, I couldn't settle down. And I took those feelings that were running through my nervous system, all that cortisol, and it turned into thoughts and feelings that I projected onto my own life. And I fell into a spiral that had me looking for some kind of release. I felt like I had ants crawling under my skin, like there was a mental and emotional flood of lava that needed a physical escape. And at this point, I knew a perfect storm for self-harm was brewing. I noticed it, barely, in time to try something else first. I remembered the lady and her ridiculous ice cubes. So I grabbed an ice cube out of the freezer and I went to stand by the sink. I passed it back and forth between my hands, wove it in between my fingers, and I remember shouting, "It feels cold. It just feels freaking cold. And it's hard. And it hurts. But it feels kind of good. And it's shrinking. And I can feel the heat coming off of my hands. And it's slippery. And it's cool." And then the cube melted. And I rubbed the water all over my hands and my forearms. I touched it to my face and my neck. And somehow, I felt better. The ants were gone. The lava had cooled. The storm passed. I didn't get any special revelations about how to help my students. I didn't experience a magical shift in my self-esteem. I still had to do the dishes and wake up for work the next morning. But because of the ice, I could I was capable of taking the time for the next immediate step because my brain didn't think that life itself was a threat anymore. Now, these are examples of responsive coping skills. You use them in the moment to respond to triggers instead of being forced to react like the scared, hurting, wild animals that live in our downstairs brain. However, in order to use these consistently in crisis, we have to practice them in ordinary moments. We need to practice them when we are regulated so that they become muscle memory when we're dysregulated. Throughout the day, I try to notice my breathing. I see if it's shallow or deep, long or short, fast or slow. And then I'll box breathe for a bit while I sit in my bed or in the shower or while I'm cleaning the counter. I focus on specific sensory information to stay grounded in the moment. Before I go to sleep, I listen to all the sounds in my house and try to name them. Some days I will pick a color and try to notice and name all of the things of that color while I'm driving or walking. I notice how my clothes and the air feel on my skin. And it's not always structured. In fact, it's usually not structured at all. I don't have a carved out slot in my day marked practice coping skills. But I've made it my practice to notice. I try to notice how I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing both physically and emotionally. And this is how I'm able to notice when I'm first triggered versus catching myself when I'm already in the middle of a spiral. Now, mind you, I don't always catch it. I still find myself mid-spiral some days, needing someone else to help pull me up out of the pit. But practicing being present, that mindfulness, is the basis of my favorite coping skills. Because we can only control ourselves. And even then, we can only control ourselves in the present moment. So that seems like the most helpful place to put our attention and energy. Now, this is a lot of information, and if you're anything like me, then you are anxious about all of the different ways you need to learn to take care of yourself. You've either started making lists of what you want to do, or you've decided to tap out now before you can try and fail. If you're feeling fancy, you're probably doing a bit of both. But please remember that we are looking for progress here and not mastery, not perfection. Pick one coping skill and try it out. Then you can add in other pieces at your own pace. If you try something for a while and it isn't helping you, get rid of it. Try something else. The only way to mess this up is to keep doing something that doesn't serve you and never ever change it over the course of your whole life. One moment of survival, one small shift is progress. And that's the goal, love. Now, if you'd like to take a deeper dive into the parts of the brain, their functions, and how this relates to your mental and emotional well-being, I've placed a link to an article in the show notes. I also highly recommend anything by the brilliant neuroscientist, Dr. Caroline Leaf. Her podcast, Cleaning Up the Mental Mess, takes her research and makes it digestible and applicable for everyday people just like us. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Imperfect Progress. Please share this podcast with anyone looking for community in a complex life. And join me next week where we'll reframe our thoughts on flaws. And remember, beautiful, baby steps are progress.